A statement from Canada's Prime Minister marked a turning point in a relationship that had defined North American security since the end of the Second World War. For more than 80 years, Canada's defense planning, military procurement, intelligence cooperation, and continental security strategy were built around close integration with the United States. Then, Prime Minister Mark Carney declared that Canada's old relationship with the United States was over. Within months, policy decisions, defense investments, and international agreements began to reflect that shift. The Canada-United States Defense Partnership emerged from the security environment that followed World War II. In 1958, the two countries established the North American Aerospace Defense Command, commonly known as NORAD. The arrangement created a joint command structure responsible for monitoring and defending North American airspace. Over the following decades, the two countries expanded cooperation through NATO operations, intelligence sharing, Arctic surveillance programs, and military procurement projects. Canadian and American forces regularly operated together in Europe, the Middle East, and Afghanistan. That framework remained largely unchanged until a series of economic and political disputes altered the relationship. During the first months of 2025, trade tensions intensified following tariff measures imposed by the United States on Canadian exports. The disputes affected multiple sectors and renewed concerns in Ottawa regarding Canada's dependence on a single economic and strategic partner. As discussions continued, senior Canadian officials increasingly emphasized the need for greater national resilience and broader international partnerships. On March 27, 2025, Mark Carney publicly described the situation in direct terms. According to the report, Carney stated that the traditional relationship between Canada and the United States had fundamentally changed. He said, "The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over." The statement attracted significant attention because it came from a Canadian Prime Minister discussing the country's closest ally. However, the significance extended beyond political language. Several policy initiatives followed that indicated Ottawa intended to implement structural changes in defense planning and procurement. One of the most notable developments was the creation of the Defense Investment Agency. The agency was established to accelerate military procurement, strengthen domestic industrial capacity, and coordinate major defense projects. The Canadian government announced that the organization would focus on long-term capability development and strategic investments linked to national security requirements. At the same time, Ottawa advanced several major defense modernization programs. Among them was the development of an Arctic over-the-horizon radar system. The project is intended to improve Canada's ability to detect and track potential threats approaching North America through the Arctic region. The system represents part of a broader modernization effort focused on northern security, an area receiving increased attention from NATO members because of changing geopolitical conditions and expanding activity in the Arctic. Canada also moved forward with plans for a new polar military communications satellite network. Government documents indicate the satellites are intended to improve communications coverage in northern regions where existing infrastructure remains limited. Reliable communications have become increasingly important as military operations, surveillance activities, and commercial traffic expand across Arctic territories. Another procurement initiative involved replacing Canada's aging Challenger aircraft fleet. The Challenger aircraft have served multiple government functions, including transportation and specialized missions. Plans for replacement aircraft form part of a wider modernization effort affecting several branches of Canada's defense and government aviation capabilities. These projects emerged alongside broader discussions regarding Canada's defense spending commitments. Successive Canadian governments faced pressure from NATO allies to increase military expenditures and modernize capabilities. The Carney government accelerated several initiatives while presenting them as components of a larger strategy aimed at increasing national capacity and reducing vulnerabilities linked to external dependence. A second major development involved Canada's growing engagement with Europe. For decades, Canadian defense procurement was heavily connected to North American supply chains. Under Carney, Ottawa began expanding defense cooperation with European partners through new institutional arrangements. One of the most significant decisions involved Canada's participation in the European Union's Security Action for Europe initiative, commonly known as SAFE. Canada became the first non-European participant in the program, The initiative provides participating countries with access to collaborative procurement opportunities and defense industrial projects involving European partners. The agreement created new pathways for Canadian defense companies to participate in European programs. Government statements indicated that Canadian firms would gain opportunities to engage in supply chains connected to defense production across multiple European countries. The arrangement also provided Canada with alternatives when evaluating future procurement requirements. Canada simultaneously expanded cooperation through the Canada-European Union Security and Defense Partnership. The framework covers a range of activities, including security cooperation, defense industrial collaboration, cyber issues, and broader strategic consultations. Canadian officials described the agreement as part of a long-term effort to strengthen relationships with allies beyond North America. These moves reflected a wider policy trend. Rather than relying primarily on one partner, Ottawa began pursuing a more diversified approach to economic and security relationships. Government officials repeatedly linked this strategy to lessons learned from recent trade disputes and geopolitical uncertainty. The changes occurred while Canada maintained participation in existing alliances. NORAD remains operational, NATO commitments remain unchanged. Intelligence cooperation with the United States continues through long-standing mechanisms involving the Five Eyes Partnership and other security frameworks. Canadian and American military forces continue to conduct joint exercises and coordinate on continental defense missions. This distinction became central to understanding Carney's position. The government did not announce the end of military cooperation with the United States. Instead, officials emphasized reducing dependence while expanding alternatives. The policy direction focused on diversification rather than separation. Additional developments reinforced that interpretation. Canada strengthened defense relationships with European partners while continuing discussions regarding modernization of NORAD infrastructure. Investments in Arctic surveillance systems were also designed to support broader continental defense objectives that benefit both Canada and the United States. Analysts noted that the shift represented one of the most substantial adjustments in Canadian defense policy since the Cold War period. The reason was not the termination of existing alliances, but the introduction of new procurement channels, new industrial partnerships, and new strategic priorities operating alongside traditional arrangements. The timing of the transition reflected broader international developments. Russia's war in Ukraine increased attention on defense industrial capacity across NATO countries. Growing competition in the Arctic raised concerns regarding surveillance and infrastructure. Trade disputes highlighted vulnerabilities within highly integrated supply chains. These factors contributed to policy discussions taking place in Ottawa throughout 2025 and into 2026. By early 2026, the practical elements of the strategy were becoming visible. New defense institutions had been established. Arctic modernization programs were advancing. European defense partnerships were expanding. Procurement discussions increasingly involved suppliers and partners outside the traditional North American framework. The result was a measurable shift in Canada's strategic posture. For decades, defense planning operated under the assumption that close integration with the United States would remain the dominant organizing principle. Under Mark Carney's government, Canada began building additional networks, additional procurement options, and additional industrial partnerships while maintaining existing alliance commitments. The process marked a significant change in how Ottawa approaches national security, defense investment, and international cooperation. Another indicator of the shift emerged through Canada's growing emphasis on domestic defense production. Government announcements linked several procurement programs to the objective of strengthening Canadian industrial capacity. Officials argued that future defense investments should create economic activity inside Canada while supporting long-term military requirements. This approach reflected concerns that heavy dependence on foreign suppliers could create vulnerabilities during periods of geopolitical tension or supply chain disruption. The broader policy direction also aligned with developments taking place across NATO. Since 2022, many alliance members have increased defense spending and sought to expand domestic manufacturing capabilities following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. European governments launched initiatives aimed at accelerating weapons production, improving procurement coordination, and strengthening defense industries. Canada's participation in European programs placed the country within these emerging networks while providing additional options beyond traditional North American procurement channels. At the same time, Canada's role in Arctic security continued to expand. The federal government identified the Arctic as a priority region because of increasing military activity, commercial shipping, and geopolitical competition.